What do you know about executive power? They talk about it a lot on the news lately. I think it must be a good thing for Americans, especially for our protection in times of crisis.
Executive what? Is that like in the movie Independence Day when aliens attack the world and the US president must immediately declare war without the approval of Congress, or the entire planet will be destroyed?
Yes, I think you could safely say that the framers of the Constitution would approve of the use of executive power in a dire situation like that. When they outlined the powers of the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution, the role of our country's chief executive was rather loosely defined. They began by making the broad statement: the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America, to give them the power to act in situations our founding fathers could not foresee. They also stated our leader must make sure all laws are faithfully executed, and more specifically gave them the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. They are ultimately responsible for making sure that our government runs smoothly and our nation is secure. Executive power, what we're talking about here, allows the president to act alone in times of crisis without congressional approval. Without this provision in the Constitution, the history of our country and what we experience as Americans today would be very different. Executive power is very important to our democracy because it not only serves to protect us against imminent threats to our security and independence, but it has helped to expand, unify, and strengthen our country since George Washington became the first president.
That's really interesting. Can you give me some historical examples where US presidents exercise their executive power in times of national emergencies?
Sure. One of the most well-known examples involved President Lincoln in 1863. To put an end to the Civil War before it tore the country permanently apart, he exercised his executive power several times. His boldest executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation, was not only an attempt to end slavery, but an effort to gain moral support for the North, a move he was convinced would put an end to the rebellion. He was right, and it helped save the Union.
I am intrigued by this concept of executive power. Can you give me any other examples where a president issued an executive order during a time of war or national emergency?
Well, that should be easy. There have been over 15,000 executive orders since 1789, when George Washington became the first president. After the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt used his executive power to enlarge our armed forces, protect internal security, and secure a military victory that protected much of the world against fascism. After the 9/11 attacks, President Bush used his executive power to increase the size and scope of the military, put in place an anti-terrorist sanctions program, and created the Department of Homeland Security.
This whole topic of executive power is really intriguing. Were the 15,000 executive orders all signed in response to national emergencies?
That's a great question, and it has caused for much debate. Over the years, especially since 1900, the executive order has been used much more frequently. The interpretation of crisis and threat to security has been expanded to include domestic, economic, health, and social situations that threatened or furthered the nation's welfare. It has also been used when congressional gridlock prevented important legislation or safeguards from being passed. It is in these situations that some argue the president is overstepping the bounds of his power or trying to make laws rather than faithfully execute them.
At the local level in our community of Slinger, executive power can also be used by our village president to get things done in times of emergency or to push government along.
How does the executive part of government in Slinger compare with other surrounding communities?
We're surrounded by cities and towns. Towns typically are smaller. Their town boards could be as little as 3 people. Our village has 7. Cities have councils and mayors, where we just have a president and a village board.
That's right. What we experience today as Americans would be a lot different and not as positive. Do you know forms of executive power are used at the state level and local level as well?
No, I didn't. But it makes sense because the executive branch of government at the local, state, and national level have many similarities. Can you give me some examples?
In closing, executive power is important because it protects us from imminent threats and has helped to strengthen our country over the course of its history. Some people argue that executive power should only be used when the threat is imminent or that it infringes upon the powers of Congress. Few, however, would argue that the framers of the Constitution anticipated a crisis that would require executive power. Our American experience is the envy of the world because of the bold executive actions of our commanders and chiefs.